So one day, Jesus began to tell a parable or a story to the people in his society that thought that they were righteous, thought that they were superior to others. They were the ones in ancient Jewish society that would oppress the weak and the poor. So Jesus began to tell this parable, and he said that two men went into the Jewish temple in Jerusalem to pray. One of them was a Jewish tax collector, and the other one was a Pharisee or a religious person of the day. And the Pharisee began to pray and he began to say, God, I thank you that I am not like one of these sinners, like this tax collector, but instead I am a righteous man. I give 10% of everything I own and I fast once a week. The tax collector at the same time began to pray and he said he wouldn't even look up to the sky, but instead he looked down and he began to beat on his chest and he began to say, God, have mercy on me, for I am a sinner. Now Jesus said, I tell you the truth, the one that went home justified was the tax collector. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, and those who humble themselves will be exalted. Soon after this, people began to bring their children to Jesus because they wanted him to bless them. The disciples, on seeing this, began to rebuke the people, but instead Jesus said, do not hinder the children from coming to me, for it is such as these that will enter the kingdom of God. Jesus said, I tell you the truth, those who want to enter the kingdom of God must have a faith like that of a child. So, I got a question for us. And the first question is, what does this teach us about God? Now, I think this is an extremely important question in any story from the scriptures. This is definitely a question we should ask. Um, and so I think if we begin to look at the story, we begin to, why is Jesus telling this? Um, what does this show us about the heart of Jesus? And we know from just all the Gospels that Jesus came as a full revelation of God to show us the Father's heart. And so we look at this story and we ask, what does this teach us about God? And so I think the first thing that it teaches us about God, and that He's not concerned about obedience. He's not concerned about morality. He's not concerned about this checklist of do's and don'ts. And I think in church, and if you're not a Christian, you probably have heard this from your church friends if you have them, or from Christians in general. You probably have this concept, this idea that Christianity is about morality, that it's about obedience, that it's about works, and it's really not. I think that's definitely a misconception that we've had in the church. But what Christianity is about knowing God, is about being in this relationship with Him and pursuing Him for all that He is, and being satisfied in Him for everything that He is, His love, His goodness, His righteousness. And so I think that's really what it shows us in the story. When Jesus talks about the Pharisee, he talks in such a way that it makes clear that obedience is not the way. Legalism is not the way. Checking off this list of do's and don'ts is not the way. But instead, he looks at the tax collector, the one who isn't doing these things, that isn't obeying, that isn't living a moral lifestyle, and instead, he's the one that went home justified that day. Now, I want to make a quick point. Um, Now, I've said a couple of times that obedience isn't the point, that morality isn't the point. Now, I don't mean that as a Christ follower, we shouldn't have good morals. I think ultimately morals are what point us back to God, to what our life should look like when we're in a relationship with God. So that being said, I want to go back, and so that is what I think Jesus is making the point of with the tax collector, is simply that this guy who has this brokenness, who has all this sin in his life, is the one that is justified because he comes to God and he says, I have all this sin, I have all this brokenness, and I'm not worthy to be in relationship with you. But he humbles himself and he calls out to the Father, and because of this, the Father forgives him and redeems him, and brings him back into his fold, into relationship with him. Hey, so the second question that I have for us is, what does this teach us about man, about humanity? And I think there's two aspects of this question that we need to answer. And I think the first answer that we see to this question is we see man's fallenness, we see man's sinfulness. And we see that in the Pharisee. We see um, the one that is prideful, the one that is thinks he's not sinning, but in reality, his heart is is sinful. His heart is fallen. And so I think from the Pharisee we learn that humanity is very much so fallen. Humanity is very much so sinful, and we very much so have this. I wouldn't say tendency, but sometimes we do have this side of us that says, "Hey, I want to be important. I want to raise myself up to God, and I want to say that I'm better than others. And I don't want to admit my weaknesses. I don't want to admit my brokenness." But I think the other side of this shows the image of God in us. I think it shows the goodness that God has and works in our being, and the very fact that we're created in the image of God. We see in the tax collector that he does the opposite. He doesn't hide his brokenness. He doesn't hide his sin, but instead he gives it up to God, and he says, "This is what's keeping me from you. Have mercy on me and forgive me." And so I think that shows the two sides of humanity. One, we can be cruel, we can be self-righteous, we can be prideful. And I think it shows the other side of the humanity, that we can seek God, that we can know Him, that we can be good when we're redeemed by God. And so those are, I think, the two aspects of the second question. And the third part, where Jesus says that you must have childlike faith, I think this kind of ties back to the tax collector. The tax collector obviously had some sort of faith. And just as a child has faith, if you tell a child we're going to McDonald's, the child most likely is going to believe you. And I think in the same way, when we trust in God, when we know His goodness for us, when we know His love for us, and when we believe it, and when we know that He delights in us and He wants to know us, then we can trust Him. And I think that's what Jesus is getting at. It's going.
Yeah.
Hey, bottom bay, let's start over. So I did.
Let's go.
Okay. You gotta. I can't just stop it real quick, bro.